Picture this: August 15, 1945. Across Japan, millions huddle around crackling radios, straining to hear their emperor's voice for the very first time. His words are archaic, almost incomprehensible. But the message is clear. Japan has surrendered. The war is over. But here's what most people don't realize. At that exact moment, in newsrooms across Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto, something extraordinary was happening. Journalists who had spent years writing propaganda, lies they were forced to print at gunpoint, were finally picking up their pens to write the truth. For 15 years, the Japanese military had controlled every word printed in every newspaper, every photograph, every headline. Journalists who dared to question the war effort simply disappeared. Their families never saw them again. The truth had been buried so deep that an entire generation grew up believing Japan was invincible, that victory was certain, that their soldiers were liberating Asia. And then, in a single day, everything changed. What happened when Japan's newspapers were suddenly freed from military censorship? What did they reveal? And perhaps most disturbingly, what had they been hiding from the Japanese people all along? The answers are more shocking than you can imagine. Because when the truth finally came out, it didn't just expose the horrors of war. It revealed something far more disturbing about how governments manipulate reality itself. This is the story of what Japan's newspapers revealed the moment wartime censorship ended, and why it matters more today than ever before. To understand what was revealed, you first need to understand the system that kept the truth hidden. In 1931, when Japan invaded Manchuria, the Japanese press was still relatively free. Newspapers criticized government policy. They questioned military adventures. They published casualty figures and reported on battlefield failures. The military hated this, so they created something called the Information Bureau, a bureaucratic name for what was essentially a propaganda machine. By 1937, when full-scale war with China began, this bureau had evolved into one of the most sophisticated censorship operations in history. Here's how it worked. Every single newspaper in Japan was required to have a military liaison officer stationed in their newsroom, not visiting occasionally, living there, 24 hours a day. These officers had absolute power. They read every article before it went to print. They examined every photograph. They scrutinized every headline. And they had 3 stamps: approved, approved with revisions, and banned. But here's the truly insidious part. They didn't just censor, they dictated. Each morning, every newspaper in Japan received the same packet from the Information Bureau. Inside were suggested stories about heroic Japanese soldiers, about the emperor's divine wisdom, about how Westerners were racist oppressors and Japan was liberating Asia. These weren't suggestions. They were orders. Editors who refused? They were arrested for dangerous thoughts, an actual crime in wartime Japan. Their newspapers were shut down. Their families were blacklisted. By 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, there were no independent newspapers left. Every single publication had been forced to merge into government-approved conglomerates. The Asahi Shimbun, Mainichi Shimbun, Yomiuri Shimbun, all the major papers, were now little more than printing presses for military propaganda. And the Japanese people had no idea. They read about glorious victories in the Pacific, about American and British forces fleeing in terror, about Japanese soldiers welcomed as liberators in the Philippines, in Burma, in Indonesia. They read about new weapons that would guarantee victory, about divine wind that would protect the homeland, about how Japan had never lost a major battle. All of it was lies. Meanwhile, the truth was very different. Japanese forces were being decimated across the Pacific. Cities were being firebombed. Soldiers were starving to death on remote islands. The war was being lost, catastrophically, and had been for years. But none of this appeared in the newspapers. Instead, when Tokyo was firebombed in March 1945, killing over 100,000 people in a single night, newspapers reported minor damage from enemy air raids and brave citizens defending the capital. When Okinawa fell after months of brutal fighting and over 100,000 Japanese civilian deaths, Papers called it a tactical withdrawal and praised the heroic sacrifice that was weakening the enemy. The disconnect between reality and what was printed had become so extreme that it was almost comical, except that millions of lives hung in the balance. Japanese mothers read about their sons dying glorious deaths while achieving great victories. They had no idea their sons had actually starved to death in a jungle or been incinerated in a firebombing or committed suicide rather than surrender because they'd been told Americans would torture them. This is what makes what happened next so extraordinary. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast ends. For a few moments, there's only stunned silence across Japan. And then, in newsrooms across the country, something unprecedented happened. Military liaison officers, the censors who had controlled every word for 15 years, began quietly packing their bags. Some left immediately. Others stayed a few days, unsure what to do. But their authority had evaporated in an instant. For the first time since the 1930s, Japanese journalists could write whatever they wanted. The question was, would they? Here's what you have to understand. These weren't crusading truth-tellers waiting for their moment. These were journalists who had spent years, sometimes decades, writing propaganda. They'd justified atrocities, they'd glorified war, they'd lied to millions of people, and they'd done it to keep their jobs, to protect their families, to survive. Now they had a choice. They could continue the lie, blame everything on the military, and move on. Or they could tell the truth, including the uncomfortable truth about their own complicity. What happened next surprised everyone. Starting on August 16th, literally the day after surrender, Japanese newspapers began publishing articles that were so brutally honest, so self-critical, so devastating, that Allied occupation forces, who arrived weeks later, were shocked. The Asahi Shimbun, one of Japan's largest newspapers, published an editorial titled A Confession to the People. In it, the editors did something almost unheard of in journalism. They apologized, not just for specific errors, but for their entire coverage of the war. They admitted they had lied. They admitted they had known they were lying. They admitted they had helped mislead the nation into disaster. The editorial was explosive. We deceived you. Day after day, we printed stories we knew to be false. We glorified aggression as liberation. We called defeats victories. We told you your sons died gloriously when we knew they died horribly. We told you Japan was winning when we knew Japan was losing. We did this because we were cowards. We did this because we feared for our lives. But cowardice is no excuse. We participated in the destruction of our nation, and for this we can never be forgiven. Imagine reading that. Imagine being a Japanese parent who had lost a son in the war, who had sacrificed everything because the newspapers told them Japan was winning, and then reading that admission. But that was just the beginning. Over the next days and weeks, newspapers began revealing the truth about the war, not in careful, diplomatic language, but in shocking, specific detail. The Mainichi Shimbun published a series called The War We Never Told You About. Each article revealed something that had been censored. The real casualty figures from Pacific battles, not the few hundred claimed, but tens of thousands. The truth about kamikaze attacks, not noble sacrifice, but desperate suicide missions ordered by commanders who had run out of options. The reality of conditions for soldiers, starvation, disease, cannibalism. Yes, cannibalism. The Yomiuri Shimbun published testimonies from soldiers who described eating the flesh of dead comrades to survive on islands where supply lines had been cut. This was printed in a mainstream newspaper, read by millions. Other revelations came flooding out. The truth about the Bataan Death March. Japanese newspapers had reported it as a peaceful transfer of prisoners. Now they revealed the torture, starvation, and execution of thousands of Allied POWs. The truth about comfort women, the systematic sexual slavery of women from Korea, China, and other occupied territories. The military had called them volunteer entertainment corps. The newspapers now revealed the kidnapping, coercion, and rape. The truth about Unit 731, the biological warfare unit that had conducted horrific medical experiments on Chinese prisoners. The military had kept this completely secret. Now newspapers interviewed former soldiers who described experimenting on live prisoners, testing plague bombs, and committing atrocities that rivaled Nazi concentration camps. The truth about the firebombing campaigns, not minor damage, but the complete destruction of entire cities. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, over 60 Japanese cities had been burned to the ground. Hundreds of thousands had died. Newspapers published photographs they'd been forbidden to print. Charred bodies, devastated neighborhoods, refugees with burns covering their bodies. And perhaps most significantly, the truth about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6th, when Hiroshima was destroyed by an atomic bomb, Japanese newspapers had reported a new type of bomb that caused some damage. That's it. No mention of the 70,000 people instantly vaporized. No mention of the mushroom cloud visible for miles. No mention that an entire city had ceased to exist. Now, newspapers published eyewitness accounts that were almost unbearable to read. Survivors described shadows burned into walls, the only remnants of people who had been standing there. They described people walking around with their skin hanging off in sheets, begging for water. They described children searching for parents who had been turned to ash. The censored truth about the atomic bombs was so horrific that even hardened journalists broke down while writing the stories. But here's what's really remarkable about this moment in history. Japanese newspapers didn't just reveal what had been censored. They analyzed why censorship had worked. They examined how they had manipulated the Japanese people. They exposed their own techniques. The Tokyo Shimbun published a series called How We Fooled You. Each article broke down a specific propaganda technique. How they used selective photography, always showing Japanese victories, never defeats. How they manipulated language, calling retreats strategic withdrawals, calling massacres pacification operations, calling starvation living off the land. How they created fake news, reporting battles that never happened, quoting soldiers who didn't exist, inventing speeches by generals. How they used emotional manipulation, playing on patriotism, honor, duty, and shame to silence dissent. These articles were essentially a manual on propaganda, written by the propagandists themselves. Why would they do this? Why would Japanese journalists expose their own lies so brutally? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to three factors. First, shame. Japanese culture places enormous emphasis on honor and reputation. Many journalists felt genuine shame about what they had done. Confession and self-criticism were ways of attempting to restore honor. Second, fear. The journalists knew that Allied occupation forces would arrive soon. They feared being prosecuted as war criminals, which some were. By confessing and exposing the military's propaganda machine, they hoped to show they had been victims of military coercion, not willing participants. Third, anger. Many journalists were furious at the military for forcing them to lie, for destroying their profession's integrity, for ruining their country. This was their revenge, exposing every secret, revealing every lie, destroying the military's reputation forever. Whatever their motivations, the result was unprecedented. For a few weeks in late 1945 and early 1946, Japanese newspapers were possibly the most brutally honest publications in the world. But here's where the story gets complicated, because when Allied occupation forces arrived in Japan in late August 1945, they weren't entirely happy with this outbreak of honesty. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of Allied powers in Japan, had a problem. He needed to rebuild Japan, and that meant he needed a stable, cooperative Japanese population. What he didn't need was a population traumatized and radicalized by daily revelations of how badly they'd been deceived. So on September 19, 1945, barely a month after Japan's surrender, Allied occupation authorities issued the Press Code for Japan. The irony is almost painful. Japanese newspapers had just been freed from Japanese military censorship, only to immediately fall under American military censorship. The press code prohibited newspapers from publishing anything that criticized Allied occupation forces, disturbed public tranquility, promoted militarism or nationalism, discussed the atomic bombs in detail, questioned the emperor's renunciation of divinity, encouraged hostility toward Allied powers. In other words, newspapers were free to criticize the Japanese military, which was convenient for Allied purposes, but not free to ask difficult questions about Allied conduct or occupation policies. Japanese journalists, who had just spent weeks exposing censorship and propaganda, now found themselves subject to censorship and propaganda again, just from a different government. But here's the fascinating part. Before this new censorship clamped down, Japanese newspapers had already revealed enough to fundamentally transform Japanese society. Let me give you some examples of how these revelations changed Japan. The truth about military atrocities led directly to Article 9 of Japan's new constitution, the famous Peace Clause that renounced war forever. Japanese citizens, horrified by what their military had done, supported this unprecedented constitutional provision. Japan remains one of the only nations in history to constitutionally renounce the right to wage war. The truth about propaganda and censorship led to some of the world's strongest press freedom laws. Modern Japan consistently ranks among the top democracies for press freedom, precisely because of this historical trauma. Japanese journalists remember what happens when the press becomes a tool of the state. The truth about comfort women and war crimes led to decades of historical reckoning, debates about textbooks, memorials, apologies, and reparations that continue today. This is controversial and painful, but it's also a level of historical accountability that many nations never achieve. The truth about how easily an entire population could be deceived led to a deep cultural skepticism of government claims and official narratives. Post-war Japan developed one of the most politically engaged, critical citizenries in Asia. But here's the darker side of this story. Not all the truth came out. Allied censorship prevented full disclosure of the atomic bomb's effects. For years, Japanese newspapers couldn't publish photographs of radiation victims or discuss the long-term health consequences. The full horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki wasn't revealed to the Japanese public until the occupation ended in 1952. Not all the perpetrators faced justice. The Tokyo war crimes trials prosecuted some military leaders, but many others escaped accountability. Some went on to positions in Japan's post-war government. The journalists who wrote propaganda faced no legal consequences, only social shame. And not all Japanese people wanted the truth. Some rejected the newspaper's revelations as Allied propaganda. They believed Japan had fought a righteous war and had been unfairly defeated. These revisionists remained a minority, but they never disappeared entirely. Even today, there are Japanese politicians who deny or minimize wartime atrocities. This raises an uncomfortable question. When censorship ends and the truth comes out, is that enough? Does revealing the truth automatically lead to justice, accountability, and change? History suggests the answer is no. Revealing truth is necessary, but not sufficient. Consider what happened in other countries. When Nazi Germany fell, the truth about the Holocaust emerged, but Germany didn't immediately reckon with this truth. It took decades of effort, education, memorials, laws against Holocaust denial, truth and reconciliation processes, before German society fully confronted its past. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the truth about Stalin's purges and gulags emerged, but Russia never fully reckoned with this truth. Today, Stalin is being rehabilitated, Soviet crimes are minimized, and historical accountability has been abandoned. When apartheid ended in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission forced perpetrators to publicly confess their crimes. But many South Africans feel this didn't go far enough, that truth without justice is incomplete. Japan falls somewhere in between. The truth came out immediately and dramatically. Constitutional and legal changes ensured it couldn't be easily suppressed again. But the process of reckoning with that truth, of deciding what it means, how to remember it, how to teach it, remains contentious. This is the real lesson of what Japanese newspapers revealed when censorship ended. Truth is not self-executing. Truth doesn't automatically lead to wisdom, justice, or reconciliation. Truth just gives you the option, the possibility, of doing better. What you do with that truth is up to you. Now let me tell you why this story from 1945 matters in 2024. Because right now, as you're watching this, there are countries where the press operates under censorship, where journalists who tell the truth disappear, where the population is fed a steady diet of propaganda, where reality itself is being manipulated. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and dozens of others. In Russia, independent media has been systematically destroyed. Journalists who report on the war in Ukraine are prosecuted for spreading fake news, the fake news being accurate casualty figures. The Russian people are told their military is winning, that sanctions aren't working, that the West is collapsing. It's almost identical to what Japanese newspapers printed in 1943. In China, the Great Firewall ensures the Chinese people can't access unauthorized information. The Uyghur genocide is censored. The Tiananmen Square massacre is censored. COVID's origins are censored. Anything that contradicts the party's narrative is censored. Sophisticated AI systems now scan every social media post, every news article, every text message, looking for dangerous content. In North Korea, the censorship is so complete that many citizens genuinely believe their country is prosperous and powerful, that famines are the result of American aggression, that their leaders possess superhuman abilities. What happens when censorship ends in these countries? What will their newspapers reveal? We already have some hints. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russian journalists briefly experienced press freedom. They revealed the Holodomor famine that killed millions in Ukraine, the true scale of Stalin's purges, the invasion of Afghanistan's actual casualties, the Chernobyl disaster's real death toll, the systematic lies about Soviet economic success. For a few years in the 1990s, Russian newspapers told the truth. Then Putin came to power, and the window closed again. This is the pattern. Censorship collapses, truth floods out, a brief window of honesty appears, then new censorship emerges. But it's not just authoritarian countries we need to worry about. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The tools of censorship and propaganda have evolved since 1945, and they're not only used by obvious dictatorships anymore. Modern censorship doesn't always look like military officers in newsrooms. It can look like algorithmic manipulation, where social media platforms amplify certain viewpoints and suppress others, not through overt censorship, but through invisible code. You're not told information is being hidden. It simply never appears in your feed. Corporate media consolidation, where a handful of companies control most news outlets, and critical coverage of those companies or their interests becomes impossible. The censorship is structural, built into ownership patterns, financial pressure, where advertisers, investors, or payment processors can destroy media organizations by withdrawing support. No government censorship needed. The market does it for you. Information overload, where the truth isn't suppressed but drowned in a flood of misinformation, making it impossible for ordinary people to distinguish fact from fiction. The truth is out there, but you can't find it. Selective enforcement, where laws against misinformation or hate speech are applied inconsistently, punishing critics while protecting allies. The censorship hides behind claims of safety and protection. These modern techniques are more sophisticated than what Japan's military used. They're also harder to resist because they're not obviously censorship. There's no military officer saying, "You can't print this." There's just an algorithm, a corporate decision, a financial pressure, an information environment that makes truth invisible. So what do we do about this? The lesson from Japan's newspapers in 1945 is this: the people who reveal the truth are often the same people who helped hide it. The journalists who exposed Japan's propaganda machine had been part of that machine. They knew how it worked because they had operated it. This means that truth-telling requires not just courage, but also confession. It requires admitting complicity. It requires people inside the system to risk everything by exposing the system. In modern terms, this means we need whistleblowers who reveal censorship mechanisms even when it costs them their careers. People like Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, reality winner. Whatever you think of their specific actions, they represent the principle that sometimes truth requires sacrifice. Platform employees who expose algorithmic manipulation. The Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen revealed how the company's algorithms prioritized engagement over truth. We need more people willing to do this. Journalists who investigate their own industry, who expose conflicts of interest, corporate influence, and subtle forms of censorship, who are willing to be critical of their own profession. Technologists who build tools to circumvent censorship, VPNs, encrypted messaging, decentralized platforms, not for illegal activity, but for basic press freedom. Educators who teach media literacy, who help people recognize propaganda, verify information, and think critically about what they read. Japan's newspapers taught propaganda techniques in 1945. We should be teaching how to recognize propaganda today. Citizens who support independent journalism, who pay for news from sources that aren't dependent on corporate advertisers or government funding, who create economic models that allow truth-telling to be sustainable. But most importantly, we need to remember that truth is fragile. The period when Japanese newspapers told the whole truth lasted only a few weeks before new censorship emerged. That window could close in any country, at any time. Press freedom isn't a permanent state, it's a constant struggle. Let me leave you with this final thought. In 1945, Japanese newspapers revealed the truth about the war. They exposed the lies, the atrocities, the propaganda. They did it brutally, honestly, completely. But here's what they couldn't reveal: the future. They couldn't reveal that Japan would become a peaceful, prosperous democracy. They couldn't reveal that the country that had been destroyed by war would become one of the world's most stable nations. They couldn't reveal that their moment of honesty would help create a society that valued truth over propaganda. They only knew that lying had led to disaster, and they hoped that truth might lead somewhere better. That's all any of us can do. We can't know what happens after we tell the truth. We can't guarantee that truth leads to justice. We can't promise that exposing lies will fix everything. We can only know that lies definitely lead to disaster. That censorship definitely enables atrocity. That propaganda definitely destroys societies. And we can hope that truth, however painful, is at least the beginning of something better. So the next time you read news that seems too good to be true, ask yourself, what am I not being told? The next time you see unanimous media consensus, ask, who benefits from this narrative? The next time someone tells you censorship is necessary for safety, remember, that's what they told Japanese citizens in 1940. The truth is always worth fighting for, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's painful, even when it implicates us in systems we'd rather not acknowledge. Because the alternative, the comfortable lie, the convenient propaganda, the enforced silence, always ends the same way, with a reckoning. The only question is whether that reckoning comes while we can still learn from it, or whether it comes too late. Japan's newspapers chose the first path in 1945. They revealed the truth when they could have stayed silent. They confessed when they could have made excuses. They exposed the machinery of lies when it would have been easier to let it fade into history. They weren't perfect, they didn't fix everything, but they gave Japan a chance to learn, to grow, to become something better than what it had been. That's all truth ever gives us, a chance. What we do with that chance is up to us. This has been the story of what Japan's newspapers revealed the moment wartime censorship ended. Remember it, because somewhere in the world right now, journalists are waiting for their moment to tell the truth. They're watching, they're documenting, they're preparing for the day when censorship ends and they can finally reveal what they've been forced to hide. And when that day comes, we need to be ready to listen, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be, because that's how we break the cycle. That's how we prevent the next disaster. That's how we honor the victims of propaganda and censorship throughout history, by refusing to let it happen again, by demanding truth, even when lies are more comfortable, by remembering what Japan's newspapers taught us in 1945. The truth will set you free, but first, it will make you face everything you've been hiding from. Are you ready for that? I hope so, because the truth is coming, whether we're ready or not. The only question is whether we'll have the courage to face it.